So tēnā koutou katoa, shalom chavarim. On behalf of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, welcome everyone to this reception for the United Nations International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I welcome our host, the Deputy Prime Minister, MPs, former MPs, members of the Diplomatic Corps, the Mayor of Wellington, councillors, regional councillors, and the Chairperson for the Commission of UNESCO, faith and interfaith representatives, our cherished survivors, but really I welcome everyone because this is an important collective experience, and I welcome you all to join in that. The United Nations General Assembly established the Remembrance Day in 2005 to be commemorated each year on the 27th of January, the day when Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp was liberated by the Soviet Red Army in 1945. Today is the 76th anniversary of the Liberation Day. Auschwitz typified the evil of the Nazi regime, where many Jews and other minorities perished in the Holocaust. My name is Miriam Bookman and I am Deputy Chair of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand. Before we start, a few housekeeping points. Please check that any electronic devices that might make a noise are switched off. In case of an earthquake, you should drop, cover and hold. Should the fire alarms sound, please evacuate the venue via the same route you entered. Please follow the directions of security staff and fire wardens, and the assembly point is outside at the Seideman statue. All Parliament buildings are smoke-free, and the last notice is that on arrival you were issued with a visitor's sticker, and if you could please make sure you continue to wear that and make sure it's visible. So, all over the world today, on this day, the Holocaust is being remembered and thought about, not only for its historic significance as a unique act of genocide, but also as a focus of reflection on the rise of anti-Semitism, terrorism, and white supremacy extremism around the world. Today is a day to reflect on what we as individuals and as a collective can do to stand against hatred and stand for unity and justice. And I want to acknowledge the very moving ceremony that we just had at Makara for those who were able to be there. I certainly found it very moving to reflect on what the liberation of Auschwitz meant at the time and now. The liberation, as Carol Ratnam so movingly spoke about, it wasn't a joyous occasion, and for many people it was the darkest day of their lives as the reality, their new reality set in. And today we recognise in particular the displaced people as a result of the Holocaust, many of whom would have gone through that liberation experience. We are lucky today that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, our government, through the Human Rights Commission and other organisations, work to oppose racism in its corrosive offshoots. However, we have to face the fact that we are not immune to these threats, as the tragic Christchurch Mosques massacre showed. We all have a part to play in ensuring a peaceful and tolerant society. We know that forces of large-scale racism, violence, and war at some point begins on the small scale, meaning all of us have a responsibility to stand up for what is right and avoid complacency. This also means that the work of the Holocaust Centre is ever more important. We are grateful to our volunteers and supporters for ensuring that educating young people on the Holocaust and what it means to be an upstander lies at the heart of what we do. We stand by our commitment to education, particularly for young people, to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust are known for today. The message from our Governor-General, Dame Patsy Reddy, who is also the Holocaust Centre's patron, is that we must teach the next generation of New Zealanders that the discrimination, hatred and violence that led to the murder of 6 million Jews and many other victims, including disabled and Roma, must never, and for their sexuality, must never be allowed to exist in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Today we reflect on what it means to stand against prejudice in our everyday lives and through our everyday interactions. In the Jewish faith, when a person dies, We light a yahrzeit, or memorial candle, in their memory. So in memory of the approximately 6 million Jews who were killed during the Holocaust, we will begin with the lighting of 6 candles. Firstly, I call on Inge Wolf with her son Simon and grandson Sam. Inge is a Holocaust survivor from Austria and the founding director of the Holocaust Center. She's a real inspiration for anyone who's ever met her. For the second candle lighter, I call on Eileen Carroll. Eileen is a second-generation Holocaust survivor, the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Eileen is an artist who incorporates Holocaust and Jewish imagery in much of her work. I now call on Stephen Stedley with his son Ben Stedley and granddaughters Susanna and Nora. Stephen is the founding chairperson of the Holocaust Center, himself a Holocaust survivor from Budapest. The next candle will be lit by Helene Ritchie. Helene is the daughter of Holocaust survivors, second-generation Holocaust survivor. Helene has contributed greatly to the public life of Wellington and is a board member of the Holocaust Center. I now call on Eileen Silestean and daughter Lisa. Eileen survived the Holocaust coming to New Zealand thanks to Max and Annie Deckston, a Deckston child from Poland. Both Eileen and Lisa have also played a large part in the Holocaust Center from its early years. We will hear more of Eileen's story later in the program. And is also joined by her other daughter, Glenda. Philip Rosenbaum and his son Daniel and granddaughter Haya. Philip is a second-generation Holocaust survivor. Thank you to our candle lighters. I always find it both very poignant when children are involved in Holocaust ceremonies, and particularly candle lighting. Although we're remembering horrific atrocities, it's lovely to see hope in the room through the literal skipping of a child. Please now all stand for 1 minute's silence in honour of the 6 million. Thank you. Please be seated. We are now going to see a short tribute in memoriam to the Holocaust survivors resident in New Zealand who died during the last 12 months. We truly honour the memories of those lives. Just looking at those names, that's a group of people who contributed tremendously to both the Jewish community but also the wider community. So may their memory be a blessing. It is a pleasure now to ask our host for today's reception, the Honourable Grant Robertson, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance and Member of Parliament for Wellington Central, to now address us. Thank you, Grant.
O tihei Māori ora, he mihi ana ngā mana whenua ki tēnei rohi, nā te iawa, Taranaki whānui, te ati awa Taranaki whānui, te upaka o te ika a tēnā koutou katoa. E nā tini mate haere, haere, haere atu rā. Āputi hono tātai hono rātou, ki hiunga mate ki a rātou. Āputi hono tātai hono, tātou te hunga ora ki a tātou. E nā mana, e nā reo, rau rangatirama a nā hoa e whā, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai, welcome to Parliament today. It's my great pleasure to be here and host you on this most special of days. I said rau rangatirama a nā hoa e whā. That means the great chiefs from the four winds, and that's a good way of getting around having to acknowledge every single person in the room who is significant and important today. But I do want to acknowledge our friends from the Diplomatic Corps who join us here today. This is a special day for acknowledgement of your role in supporting this day. I want to acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues past and present. This is always a dangerous endeavour to acknowledge, but I've seen my colleague Greg O'Connor here today, my colleague Ibrahim Omar, who I will mention again shortly, Chris Bishop, Nicola Willis, and I think Nicole McKee, and Barbara Edmonds, who I've just seen right in front of me there. If I keep going, I'll name all 120. But thank you for your work. And I want to especially acknowledge my friend and former colleague, Alua Manavo, Dame Winnie Laban, for your long-standing support of the Jewish community here in Wellington and of this day. It's great to see you here today, Winnie. I too want to add my acknowledgements to the survivors. This is a day where we truly acknowledge your courage, your bravery, and your ongoing presence as a reminder not only of the Holocaust, but of the strength of this community in years that have gone past that point. I thank you once again. Paul, I want to acknowledge Paul Seideman being here today again. Paul, it is so good that you are able to join us again today, and we'll celebrate your contribution shortly when we come to talk about the essay competition. This year, the theme around UN Remembrance Day is around the question of displaced persons. And there is no doubt when we think about the contribution made by those who were displaced to New Zealand, what an extraordinarily lucky thing for New Zealand it was that this group of people came to our shores. But it was not based on choice. It was based on the outcome of the most appalling genocide that we have seen in the history of the modern history of our planet. So for people to come displaced from their homelands to contribute so much is an amazing thing. What it does today is serve to remind us of the importance of the Holocaust Centre's goals and aims, to witness, to remember, to educate, and to act. So today we can bear witness to the genocide and to the atrocity that took place. We can bear witness to the strength of character of those who emerged from it and those who didn't. And we can remember their work through our time in New Zealand. But it is on the last two elements I want to just say a few words today. The importance of educating and of acting. We were very fortunate at this election in my party, the Labour Party, to have around 22 new colleagues join our caucus, all of whom are going, I believe, to make an amazing contribution to our country. But one of them was my friend, Ibrahim Omar. Ibrahim is a displaced person. He came here from Eritrea as a refugee in 2012. And here he is, as he often remarks somewhat in awe, that 8 years later, he is a member of our New Zealand Parliament. We as a country can be proud of the fact that within an 8-year span we have someone from Ibrahim's background joining us in Parliament. But we can never ever be complacent. We can never ever believe that this country lives up to every day the standards of inclusion and respect and of memory and of honour to those who have gone before. Because sadly it doesn't. I love the fact that New Zealand is an inclusive place, a place where no matter where you're from or what your background is, you can achieve. But we don't get that unless we work at it every single day. And Miriam mentioned March 15th earlier on. That's a cause for us to remember, to honour, to witness, to educate and to act. The rise of extremism, white supremacy, terrorism around the world means that we as a country can never be complacent. We do well, but we are not immune. And so this day, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, gives us an opportunity to reflect on the Holocaust and the incredible impact it had on the Jewish community around the world. But it must also be the day where we remember it is our job to educate about that history, and the Holocaust Centre deserves enormous credit for the role that you are playing in that, but also to act, to stand up against racism, to stand up against white supremacy, acts of extremism and acts of terrorism. Because we said to ourselves before March 15th, 2019, it could never happen here. And it did. And so on this day, I call on all of us to act, to call out acts of racism, to stand up against them together. I acknowledge the presence in the room today of our Race Relations Commissioner Meng Foon and say, Meng, your work is tough, but it's work we should all support every day. Not just because it is standing up against something that is wrong and that can lead to such dire consequences as we remember today, but because of the opposite reason, because we're better than that. Because as a country, we celebrate that we are better than that. And so acting against racism is a positive thing. It's about creating an environment of respect and inclusion. Moving beyond my least favourite word in the English language, tolerance, because when you tolerate something, you put up with something. It's not about tolerance, it's about inclusion and respect and embracing our diversity as a country and remembering the consequences of not doing that. Today, I acknowledge the Jewish community of Wellington. I acknowledge the survivors in the room and your whānau and the whānau of survivors who are here. Your courage, I will always witness, remember, and I hope today we can all take from here the importance of educating and acting together as a country to include all those who have come before us and to remember the importance of the contribution of those who were displaced in New Zealand. We are forever grateful. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Minister, for those thoughtful words, and in particular the call to action for all of us. One of the key messages we promote with young people is to be an upstander, to stand up to racism. But I think it's just as relevant for us adults too. Scenarios or I guess, times where we need to be upstanders and not bystanders. Sometimes they're grey or tricky or difficult, but it's really important in today's world to maintain that upstander spirit and for each and every one of us. So thank you. I'll now ask you to present the prizes of the Paul Seideman Annual Composition Award. Now, this award was established with a generous donation from a very special man, Paul Seideman, who was a Czech teenager in 1942 when he was subject to the Europe-wide Nazi anti-Jewish machinery. Paul survived several labour and death camps, including Auschwitz, and was liberated by the United States Army from Dachau camp in April 1945. We are honoured to have Paul here today at the prize giving of the competition named after him. The awards are given in 3 categories for students in Year 7 and 8, Year 9 and 10, and 11 to 13. Due to the Paul Seideman Annual Composition Award, the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand has seen an increase in teacher response to the new programs that we are offering. From our online webinars to our new teaching trunks, the Paul Seideman competition has helped to bring the Holocaust education to more students and schools around the country. Could the winners please come forward? And you'll also be hearing from them later on in the program. And if I could ask that the winners stay up here after they are presented their certificate for a photo opportunity. So the first is Mayaan Bialik, Year 7 at Remuera Intermediate in Auckland. Felix Steiner, Year 10 at Rongotai College here in the capital. And Leah Berger, Year 13 at Rosehill College in Papakura. Thank you, Minister, the prize winners, and very special thank you to Paul. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, is charged with providing educational outreach on the Holocaust in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, it has for many years been the supportive major co-sponsor of the annual Holocaust Remembrance Day, not only here, but also in Auckland, Hamilton, Napier and Christchurch. We are very grateful for this ongoing support. And I now invite Robyn Baker, the chairperson of the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO, to speak to us.
Ena mana, ena reo, e rau rangatirama, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. As I reflect on the challenges of the past year, including the impact of the pandemic, I think of people who are already living in the most strained of circumstances, refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced peoples. In fleeing persecution, millions around the world are cut off from families, homes, culture, and shared knowledge. The pandemic has made the lives of these people even more difficult, as well as drawn many more into dire living conditions. UNESCO was established after World War II in the belief that lasting peace must be founded on dialogue and mutual understanding. UNESCO works to build equality between people by sharing knowledge and enabling access to knowledge. It does this in a range of ways, and often, I admit, in ways that seem to be reasonably dry, such as international agreements, but these can make truly life-changing differences for people. Recognition of education is a huge barrier for many displaced persons. Imagine arriving in a new country and thinking that your major asset was your education and finding your qualifications were not recognised. The complications this adds to the already challenging tasks of settling into a new country are immense. In 2019, UNESCO adopted the Global Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications Concerning Higher Education. Put simply, the Global Convention asks that people's qualifications are recognised fairly, supporting displaced people to be able to build their lives and contribute to their new country. During the last year, the importance of education and access to it has been starkly highlighted by the pandemic. Without access, education stops, and when education stops, the gaps between people grow wider. UNESCO is one of the many organisations who have been proactive in creating networks and quality resources for educators and families to use during lockdown. Education, learning and developing understanding also comes in the form of sharing stories and experiences, something we've heard a lot used today. It's a very powerful way to, when you hear people's personal stories, to remind you of the sacrifices people have made and of the contribution people have made under very difficult circumstances. Sharing stories and experiences not only helps create empathy between people, it brings the reward of being heard, especially for those who have not been able to express themselves, their values, their beliefs or their religion freely in their home countries. This basic human right, freedom of expression, is an important value to uphold. This is of central importance to UNESCO and, of course, vital to our democracy. In our busy and very complex world, it's all too easy for the needs of groups of people and individuals to be unnoticed and often unheard. Or as individuals, sometimes we find it hard to know how to help. In recent years, the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO has supported a number of community groups, provides space for people with different perspectives to share their stories and opportunities for the wider community to hear them. One project the National Commission supported a couple of years ago was Te He Tangata, which is the breath of the people. It was a wonderful and powerful project which aimed to elevate the voices of homeless people and provide an opportunity for them to share their histories and their stories with the wider community. Students from Massey University worked collaboratively with these people to develop their stories and then share them face to face with the wider community. What could be a more powerful way to foster a sense of belonging? The feedback from both of those who shared the stories and those who heard them was very uplifting. Another more recent example was of our work in New Zealand was to support a project that we supported a number of projects during lockdown, but the Mapura Studios, which works with a special needs community in Auckland, was particularly interesting. They work with, they found during the lockdown that their community felt very isolated, as a lot of people did, and they also found that they were quite fearful about masks. So what they did was they had an activity where they created masks. And the idea here was to see masks as something to enjoy, not to be fearful of. The community felt displaced by the lockdown, and through this activity they were able to join together, and also later, as they shared their creations, more connected again with their communities. It brings to mind a comment I heard from a participant in the Youth Diversity Forum that we organised in late 2019 as a response to the devastating terrorist attacks on mosques in Christchurch. After a weekend where about 100 young people gathered together, a young participant told me that she had never, before that weekend, had the opportunity to speak with someone who identified as Muslim. She said she felt so lucky to have had the opportunity to learn through face-to-face conversations. These young leaders' vision for Aotearoa is that everyone will accept, respect and celebrate each other's differences within thriving communities where all people can find a sense of belonging and be able to contribute to the shaping of the future of our country. On that note, and just to finish, and to add actually to all the other speakers, and in this case particularly to the Mayor who made this comment about one of the contributions made by one of my predecessors as a chair of UNESCO National Commission was Fred Turnowski. And he came as a refugee to New Zealand in 1940 and went on to lead the National Commission in the 1970s. He represented New Zealand on the executive board and was at the forefront of the efforts to recognise New Zealand's place in the Pacific by moving us out of the Europe regional grouping, which I find amazing that we were ever in the Europe regional grouping, into the Asia-Pacific grouping. This has had a significant impact on our work today, and actually probably the work of many of us and many groups that we see ourselves as a part of the Pacific and the Pacific region, and we feel a responsibility in that area as well. However people are displaced within our society or across borders, we all have a responsibility to notice, to listen and to respond, and to play our part in creating communities where everyone can find a place, feel safe, know they belong, and where they have the opportunities to contribute to their community, their country, and their world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robyn. One thing you said sort of early on in your speech, which stuck out to me, is the importance of telling stories in education. And when you said that, I sort of felt a great responsibility, both as the Holocaust Centre, but also just as a person, particularly in relation to the stories and the testimony of the Holocaust. Given that our survivor population is sadly declining, that means it's incumbent on us to continue to tell that testimony and make sure that the lessons of the Holocaust and those stories of the Holocaust and the people of the Holocaust continue to be told. Our theme, as you know, for this year's event is displaced persons, those who either survived or managed to escape the Holocaust and came as refugees to New Zealand. About 1,200 were admitted here, in spite of government reluctance, and contributed hugely to the development of this country in architecture, the arts, medicine, science, the law, business, politics, hospitality, and when successful, to philanthropy, as well as the huge contributions made to the Jewish community. One person of special musical talent was Claire Galambos, an Auschwitz survivor who came from Hungary and played for over 30 years in the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra. We are pleased to have with us today Sarah Gaetanos, who wrote Claire's biography called The Violinist. It was launched at this commemoration in this hall 10 years ago to the day by the then Minister for the Arts, the Honourable Chris Finlayson. Thank you, Sarah, for what you did to put Claire's life story and contribution to New Zealand into the historical record. After 2 reprints, the book was out of print, but the publishers, Victoria University Press, have supplied a further reprint in time for today's event. Next, we will hear from Eileen Silestean, who came to Wellington in 1935 when she was about 8 years old, a displaced child. Her speech will be read by Eileen's daughter, Lisa, a former board member of the Holocaust Centre.
I'm Lisa Silestean, and it's an honour to speak here this afternoon to the distinguished guests that have already been greeted by our MC. The definition of child displacement is the complete removal or separation of children from their parents and immediate family or settings in which they have initially been reared. I'm reading this on behalf of my mother, Eileen Silestean. I was born in Bialik, Poland in 1926. The month and date of birth unknown, so my passport states, and I was named Chaya Sirota. I was placed in a Jewish orphanage at number 7 Częstochowska Street as a baby. The orphanage housed Jewish boys and girls with ages ranging from babies up to about 13. Sadly, I never knew my parents. My time spent in the orphanage was a happy one. We were well treated. We all went to a Hebrew school called Tarbut, which was situated right next door to a Catholic school. I recall many altercations because being Jewish, we were disliked. We learnt Hebrew, we spoke Polish and Yiddish, which was the main language in the orphanage. I also remember the windows being taped as there was already talk of war. In early 1935, when I was about 9 years old, the person in charge of the orphanage came to me to say that a nice couple, Annie and Max Deckston, wanted to bring orphan Jewish children to New Zealand, and they had chosen me as one of them. Well, they may as well have told me I was going to the moon, as I had no idea of where New Zealand was. I only knew of Russia on one side of Poland and Germany on the other. At the time, it was quite bewildering for me. When I said goodbye, the children presented me with an autograph book with all their names, as well as one from the Hebrew school, which I still have to this day. I was sad to leave the children in the orphanage, but as a young child, I didn't understand what displacement was, and I saw this as an adventure. In April 1935, I left the orphanage to meet up with 7 other children from different towns chosen to travel with me. Of the 8 of us, there were 3 girls and 5 boys. Our chaperones were Robyn and Freda Wise and their baby son Michael, who were actually related to the Deckstons. And so our journey began. We boarded a train for Warsaw, which was rather exciting for me, as I'd never seen or travelled on a train before. At the port of Gdansk, we boarded the SS Baltonia bound for London. My first impressions on boarding the ship were ones of terror, as I thought it was a house floating on water. After sailing for 3 days, we finally berthed in London, where we were met and taken to a Jewish shelter. This was a stopping place for people arriving from different parts of Europe en route to other destinations. We couldn't speak English, of course, but the 10 days we were in London were very exciting. We boarded the ship, the SS Rosehill, for the next big part of our journey. The trip to New Zealand took 6 weeks. Thanks to a lovely German lady, we managed to communicate, and she was the one that told us the Polish president had died. We all cried. Life on board was pretty good, and time meant nothing to us. On June 12, 1935, we finally sailed into Wellington Harbour. My first impression was rather scary, as all I could see were houses perched on enormous hills, and I couldn't see paths to get there. So our first day began in our new country. Annie and Max Deckston met us at the wharf. They looked rather formidable to me as a child. The first thing we were told was to address the Deckstons as Auntie and Uncle. Almost immediately, Auntie instructed a Mrs. Carlyle to anglicise our names. I became Eileen Deckston. The home in Rintle Street, Newtown, was very big. The Deckstons kept a strict kosher home. We had separate milk and meat kitchens. Uncle took one of the boys, David, and I to Tawa one day. I can remember asking, "Uncle, how far to Bialystok?" He kept answering, "Not far." I truly believed I was going back home to Poland. We were enrolled at South Wellington Primary School, which was in Rintle Street, about 6 minutes from our home. I was put into Standard 1. My first day at school was very strange, and not being able to speak the language made it even worse. We settled down, and within 6 months I was able to speak English. We were not allowed to speak Polish in the home, only English and Yiddish. 2 years passed, and then on 7th of April 1937, 12 more children arrived from Poland, 8 girls and 4 boys. There was great excitement, and we were looking forward to meeting them, as we were now proper Kiwis and spoke good English. I'll never forget how wonderful it was to go to the wharf to meet the new arrivals. They were beautifully attired in beige coats with berets to match. I was so excited because Bernie Giel, who had been in my orphanage in Poland, was one of the new arrivals, so I was able to get news of everyone. The new arrivals settled in well. Life in the Deckston home was good most of the time. We held concerts. David had a beautiful voice and sang Yiddish songs. Mr. Goldblatt from the Jewish community used to come and play the piano. We went to the synagogue on the terrace every Saturday. I remember my first time when we were so warmly greeted by the community, especially on seeing so many children speaking Yiddish. We had to clean the whole house every morning before leaving for school, so we were always late. One day our headmaster, Mr. Edie, announced at assembly, if the Deckston children come on time to school for a week, they can have a half day off. In 1937, tragedy struck. Alec, one of the boys, drowned in a whirlpool during a trip we all went on to Paraparaumu. It was the saddest day of my life. He was only 14 and such a lovely boy. Despite some of the hardships, life was pretty good as we had each other to play with. We were actually envied by school friends, especially ones who had no brothers or sisters. Our biggest shock came when on September 26, 1938, Erev Rosh Hashanah, Auntie passed away, aged 67. It was a terrible time for us. I remember all the children standing around her bedside as she lay dead for us to say goodbye. Uncle passed away a year later on November the 9th, 1939. And from 1940 to 1945, the orphanage continued to function with the appointed trustees from the Jewish community in charge. All the children used to get mail from their families in Poland except for me. I used to cry and think, why doesn't someone ever write to me? We were all listening to the wireless one day and heard that Hitler had marched into Poland. This shocked us and we sobbed. Letters stopped arriving after that, and none of the children had any news of their families until after the war. Despite having lost my identity and the only family I knew, I owe my life to Max and Annie Deckston, who saved me from the fate of most of the children that I left behind in the orphanage at 7 Częstochowska Street in Poland, who never survived. Looking back on my life, I have been truly blessed since with my own family, my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen and Lisa, for sharing that incredible story, which gave a real insight of being a displaced young person in New Zealand. The story really showed the impact of the generosity of the Deckstons. Thank you. The memory of the Holocaust and an understanding of its history and impact is a central part of the Holocaust Centre's educational mission. And this is very much represented through the entries of the Paul Seideman Composition Award entries. We're now going to hear from the Paul Seideman Composition Award winners reading their prize-winning entries. The topics were, years 7 to 8, the Holocaust began with words from a minority view and silence from the majority. Describe how you and your school prevent bullying and hate speech. The years 9 to 10 and 11-13 topic was, the events of the Holocaust led to unfathomable suffering amongst millions of people throughout Europe. Explain how the idea of resilience helped Holocaust survivors throughout the events from 1933 to 1945. We'll start with the Year 7 prize winner, Mayaan Bialik from Remuera Intermediate in Auckland.
Good afternoon. Silence never encourages the tormented, only the tormentor. The Oxford Dictionary defines silence as a complete absence of sound. However, in this case, it means a complete absence of standing up for yourself and the people around you, out of fear or lack of care. Throughout history and today, this statement has remained true and continues to resonate in all aspects of life. From the world stage of politics to local neighborhoods, schools, and even our personal circles. From a young age, we were taught to speak up against what we don't perceive to be right. There are countless examples worldwide of instances when silence puts an individual or group in harm's way out of the fear of speaking up against the aggressor. The tragic events of the Holocaust demonstrated the enormity of the consequences of being a silent majority. They came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. That is the summary of the cowardice and silence held by the majority of German citizens, whilst knowing of the atrocities of the Holocaust, as described by Martin Niemöller. It wasn't until General Eisenhower revealed the concentration camps in Germany that the public heard of the inhumane monstrosities that the Germans had been committing throughout the war. The US's own allies, the USSR, refused to publicly acknowledge the existence of these camps until Eisenhower did so. They were ashamed that while knowing of them, they didn't speak out for those being tortured within their own walls. This shows that neutrality is not an option, and that neutrality will only ever help the oppressor, never the victim. In the modern world, issues might not seem as critical. Nevertheless, they still demand from us to continue implementing the lessons learned from the past of people not using their voices to speak up for what is right. A modern example experienced by many is bullying. Teachers in my school believe that to prevent bullying, you need to educate both the bully and the bullied. Bullying comes in many different forms, one of which is verbal. Every year, my school holds an annual speech competition, and this year, students were encouraged to create a speech on racism and the injustices given to someone because of their ethnicity. In my school, students are taught to have peaceful discussions on subjects that can provoke hate speech in the media. Before the 2020 New Zealand elections, my school created a simulation election where students would go through the same process as their parents, voting for Prime Minister and MPs, to teach kids peaceful discussion and to educate for tolerance. We, the future generation of Kiwis, should be brave to stand up against any aggressors. We should be able to convey our ideas without promoting hate and insult to those who think differently. The Holocaust is teaching us all the importance of treating others as you wish to be treated yourself, while promoting respect for all people. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mayaan, for sharing why it's important not to be silent. And I think with those incredible skills as an orator, I'm confident that you will always be there to speak up and stand up. Felix Steiner with his, I now invite Felix Steiner with his Year 10 winning entry from Rongotai College here in the capital.
The horrors of the Holocaust were one of the key events in history which truly brought forth the raw power of resilience. During World War II, the Nazi implementation of concentration and death camps in Europe forced people to adopt the resilience needed to survive. The detainment of these people ruined the lives of everyone around them and forced the inhabitants to fight every day for their survival. Jewish people demonstrated the concept of resilience through resistance, both physical and spiritual. The first examples of true physical Jewish resistance during the Holocaust occurred between 1941 and 1943, when underground Jewish resistance movements started forming in over 100 concentration camps throughout German-occupied Europe. The main goal of these uprisings was to break free and join the fight against the Nazis. Ultimately, the Jews knew their resistances would not do much against the wave of German influence spreading across Europe at the time. Yet they still made the decision to fight for their freedom and to spread the idea of resistance across Europe. A famous example of revolution fever was the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt in 1943. The revolution in the ghetto lasted almost a month before the Nazis finally managed to pacify the remaining Jewish fighters. But even with it ending their loss, this is still one of the key events that boosted the Jewish community to ignite the spark of revolution and lead the final charge to revolt against their Nazi oppressors. This shows that resilience took the form of physical resistance against Nazi oppression. But violent revolution and resistance was not the only way Nazi prisoners were able to show resilience during the decimation of their people. Underground synagogues and prayer houses were created to allow Jews to practice their religion in secret. An example of this is when prisoners were killed in concentration camps, the Jewish community would offer a kaddish, or prayer for the dead, to make sure that they passed peacefully. The fact that the Jewish people were willing to risk their lives just despite the guards and continue the religion that bound them all together, even if it was just a small remnant of their past prayers, shows the strength and resilience these people demonstrated every single day. The Rosenstrasser Project is a good example of non-violent resilience, as this was a peaceful march by non-Jewish spouses and relatives during 1943 to protest the arrest of their husbands, wives, and relatives. I swore never to be silent. Whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. This is a quote by Ali Weissel, the author of Night, which perfectly shows the resilient mindset between prisoners in concentration camps. It reveals that the idea of never giving up and making sure that you always stand up for what you believe in, even if it may cost your life. For many of the Jewish prisoners, though, the struggles did not end with the liberation of their ironclad cages. In fact, with the stigma between the Jewish peoples, it was very hard to leave Germany, let alone Europe. Between 1933 and 1939, while the Nazi Party was slowly gaining traction and revealing their anti-Semitic beliefs and the idea of a master race, the Jewish community looked to escape this persecution. New Zealand was one of the most appealing options for relocation, but there were certain boundaries, as at the time Jews weren't classified as refugees, and so were subject to the Immigration Restriction Amendment Act, which stated that it prevented aliens from Europe entering New Zealand unless they had guaranteed employment, a considerable amount of capital, or possessed knowledge and skills which would enable them to rehabilitate readily, but without detriment to any resident of New Zealand. This meant it was a lot harder for people to easily relocate to another country to escape the Nazis. Henceforth, the concept of resilience was key in staying unharmed while finding somewhere safe to live. Resilience is a feeling which everyone has experienced at least once during their time on Earth, but this feeling has never been demonstrated more than during the Holocaust. This feeling is the driving force behind a lot of the great revolts that helped and succeeded in taking down Nazi Germany. The human instinct to preserve what they believe in is shown in full force when people will sacrifice themselves for the good of their family, friends, and people they've never even met, just to make sure they will be safe to live and continue in the memory of those they have lost. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felix, for those very insightful thoughts on resilience. Lastly, I welcome Leah Berger, who is Year 13 at Rosehill College in Papakura.
The light that defies the darkness. In the Bible, there is a verse that tells us, "Do not fear, for the evil's destruction will come." The word destruction that is used in this verse is the same word that is used for Holocaust in Hebrew, shoah. It can be interpreted as a prophecy for the Holocaust, but it can also be an inkling that the nation's enemies will fall to destruction themselves. By reading literature of all kinds, we can find hidden meanings amongst them, which brings me to consider Holocaust survivor literature. The word Holocaust itself is synonymous with great pain and loss to the Jewish people. It is something we carry with us, but the way we carry it is unique and individual. It is a defining feature that either makes us weak or empowers us. 3 generations later, and it is still part of who we are. For a defining moment, Anne Frank said, "Look at how a single candle can both define and defy darkness." This specific genre of literature is part of the Jewish people's defiance against the darkness inflicted by the Nazis and is a tribute to each and every victim's suffering. And that's why it's so important to keep Holocaust literature alive. Maus, authored by Art Spiegelman, is a powerful insight into the relationships of survivors and survivors' demeanor. While it shows us the story depicting trauma, it is parallel with the story set in the present, which focuses on the aftermath of the Holocaust. What our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents went through was so extreme and traumatic that it has been engraved in our minds forever and might as well be a genetic quality we all inherit. In this work, Jews are illustrated as mice throughout the graphic novel, which holds a layer of symbolism for us to analyze. Mice are animals that will always avoid danger at any cost, and that is an underlying theme in a lot of survivor literature. These extreme circumstances brought out our human tendency to want to survive, just like mice. Mice are also relatively weak and are depicted as prey to the Nazis, who are illustrated as cats. Another powerful insight in this work is how relationships have evolved between parent and child into a new dynamic. We see, like many other survivors, Vladik, the father of the protagonist, displays qualities of clinginess that drives him into a waste not, want not mindset, while also treating his relationships in the same manner. Despite this idea amongst survivors' psyche, many find it hard to share their experiences in fear of reliving it. So when Vladik chooses to share his experience with his son, we can imagine the tremendous strength it must have taken. Vladik shows resilience by telling his own story to his son, and in doing so, he passes on these qualities. When evaluating Vladik's motives, we can link this back to the evolved dynamic of the relationship and can be explained by the need to protect one's own children from harm. This new dynamic isn't completely shattered. Contrary to our assumptions, it is simply cracked, healed by victims' enlightenment about the value of family and the need to prevent such things from happening again. Holocaust literature stems out of the exigency to protect anyone else from such danger. We must read it and never forget. While the symbolism is mostly about tragedy and trauma, we can find an underlying theme of vengeance and regrowth in survivor literature. The Watch by Elie Wiesel is an emotive short story accompanied with powerful phrases that evoke the audience to feel an underlying tone of sorrow. Feverishly, furiously, my hands claw the earth, impervious to the cold, fatigue, and pain. The trauma Elie Wiesel experienced during the Holocaust led him to feel passionate about the injustice he experienced. He builds up the narrative with the idea of desperately needing something to be done. Here it is, in the palm of my hand, the last relic, the only remaining symbol. When Wiesel was feverishly digging, we can find a hidden meaning that he wasn't just looking for a watch. He was looking for a way to restore the dignity he had lost. I want to transform my watch into an instrument of delayed vengeance. Since we all know that you cannot change a watch into an instrument of vengeance, the author is positioning us to think about the meaning behind it, and to think about the vengeance every survivor warrants. Survivor literature is, in a way, delayed vengeance. Out of pain and sorrow they grew and used their rage to fuel themselves, their literature, and their accomplishments. Elie endured, survived, and showed resilience in order to avenge himself and his fellow victims. Holocaust survivors built a Jewish home and told their stories so that a thing like this will never happen again, and that is a quality I hope we all inherited. Anne Frank did not survive, but she has a lot to teach us about surviving. A survivor can be defined as someone who lives on while others have died. And therefore, the people who are left are always responsible to fix the injustice, and that includes us. Her diary is admirable since she's constantly showing resilience while always trying to find meaning and hope in a world that offers very little. In Anne's words, "In the eyes of the world, we are doomed. But if there are Jewish people left, they will be held up as an example. Maybe we will teach the world about goodness, and this is the only reason we have to suffer." Perhaps when talking about inherent human nature and the Holocaust, we should talk less about the brutalities of the Nazis and more about the human desire to relentlessly find hope. And by finding purpose, we find hope. Anne Frank's strength throughout her life in hiding gave not only the people she hid with hope and strength of their own, but millions of her readers. As a Jew, I find purpose in keeping this memory alive. Holocaust literature is a testament to all survivors' resilience, eagerness to survive, and one day again flourish. The essential idea of Holocaust literature being eternal should give us all hope that we will never forget their pain and suffering, and if we were to repeat our mistakes, God forbid, we would have hope to rise above it like Holocaust survivors. Without resilience, survivors would not have had the chance to tell us their stories, and we would be one step closer to repeating such heinous mistakes. And in that I find hope that a Holocaust shall never happen again. For the dead and living we must bear witness. Elie Wiesel. Thank you, Paul Seideman, for giving us the opportunity to meet you and share our thoughts and making sure we keep Holocaust literature alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah, for that amazing journey through literature. We just heard at Makara the importance and power of reading, so it was great to see that in practice. It's inspiring to hear the understanding of Holocaust history and the confidence of presentation of these three prize winners in the Paul Seideman Annual Composition Award. Please join me in congratulating them all and thanking Paul. Our commemoration will close on a note of pride and confidence in the future as we see a short presentation, We Are Still Here, Holocaust Survivors and Their Descendants. Friends, thank you for taking part this afternoon in a commemoration that is deeply significant to the Jewish community and also important to the people of Wellington and New Zealand. I would especially like to thank those who have been involved in organising this event and the event at Makara, from the catering to the AV to our incredible Holocaust Centre staff and amazing volunteers, the Wilson Funeral Home, UNESCO, Wellington City Council, and particular thank you to Sarah Williams and David Schwartz for doing so much work behind the scenes. Remembrance of the Holocaust will continue to shape our world, and the contributions of Jewish displaced persons to New Zealand's development will not be forgotten. To quote again from the Governor-General's message, the March 15th mosque attacks and the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us the power of unity. We must celebrate our differences and look at each other with humanity and kindness. We must pledge never again. And to quote from the Secretary General of the United Nations Holocaust Remembrance Day address, our best tribute to those who died in the Holocaust is the creation of a world of equality, justice, and dignity for all. You're welcome to stay on for further refreshments, and we wish you a safe journey home and hope that what you have seen and heard this afternoon will remain with you as a thought-provoking reminder of a tragic historic event that should never be allowed to happen again, here or anywhere. Shalom and ka kite ano.